Hello, everybody. I'm Sobin Pin. Welcome to Khmer Post USA TV. We are following a story on Terry Seng, a Cambodian American civil rights lawyer, has been ordered to stand trial in Cambodia on Thanksgiving Day. Joining with me now, Jared Genser, an international human rights lawyer, a former classmate of Terry Seng at Michigan Law School, has agreed to represent Terry Seng pro bono. To begin with, I think, can you share us what you learned so far?
So, I think you know a little bit about me. I'm an international human rights lawyer based in Washington, and I'm now serving as pro bono counsel to Thierry, who is a law school classmate of mine. What we know so far is pretty limited. The reality is that she received a summons to appear in court on November 26th, based on the charge of conspiracy to commit treason and incitement to commit social disorder. She faces 12 years in prison or longer if she's convicted. The summons was not given to her personally, which is what's required by Cambodian law, but it was actually posted outside a home that she lived in several years ago. What's especially worrying is, of course, that she's been charged along with some 60 others, primarily, CNRP leaders, including Seng and others. She's not a part of the party itself. It's not a member or part of the party, but she has called for the right of Renzi to be able to return to Cambodia, which of course is what international law requires. And so she's been targeted at the same time. I think we all know that the situation in Cambodia has especially deteriorated for rights defenders in the last, 3 or 4 years, especially. Obviously, Hun Sen has been in power since 1985, and after the death of Robert Mugabe, is one of the 5 longest-serving leaders in the world, dictators in the world, he's done everything possible to shut down the independent media, with the recent conviction of a journalist and another 12 being tried, and banning the CNRP and political opposition and shutting down civil society organizations. So this appears to be kind of a close to final cleanup exercise to get rid of anybody else that might stand in his way or in the government's way. I think that by law, by Cambodian law, as well as international law, Thierry has a right to know the charges against her. She has a right to the presumption of innocence, the right to an independent and impartial tribunal, the right to be able to have adequate time to prepare her defense, as well as to both cross-examine witnesses brought against her and also to bring witnesses in her own defense. But that's literally all impossible for her to do. She can't prepare because although Cambodian law requires that a detailed indictment be attached to a summons, which would explain what is the so-called evidence that's being used against her to justify the charges, she's been given no such information. So she's actually being put on trial. She's not just being investigated. Her trial itself is, next Thursday, American Thanksgiving, and she's expected to show up and defend herself against a charge or charges that she has no idea what the allegations are behind it, except that it relates to so-called activities in 2019, which are very, very clearly, free speech, the exercise of freedom of opinion and expression in terms of her criticism of Hun Sen and his regime, over the year 2019 through, media comments, as well as Facebook posts and otherwise.
Can you fly into Cambodia, defend her on that day?
I can't for 2 reasons. The first reason is I don't think I would be let in, although it didn't make sense for me to apply for a visa because I only just got involved in the case, and given COVID restrictions, I'd have to self-quarantine for 14 days when I arrived. So there wasn't enough time for me to be able to potentially do that. I'm also not qualified, of course, as a lawyer in Cambodia. So although I could try to show up at the court, I wouldn't be in a position to be able to actually defend her in the Cambodian court. But what I am doing as her international lawyer is a number of different things with the United States government that I can speak more about. And on Monday we'll be filing at the UN a specific complaint about her case as well, asking for urgent action from the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion or expression, as well as the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia. So we're going through a number of different channels in order to make very, very clear what is going on in her case. I also have an op-ed that I'm currently shopping around to get published before the trial as well, to speak out more publicly about what's happening with her and to shine a bright light on what's happening to not just with her, but how what is happening to her is illustrative of broader abuses that are happening in Cambodia today.
As Cambodian Americans, should we be worried that as Hun Sen government attacking, because Terry is a Cambodian American, she's a US citizen.
Exactly.
And as Cambodian Americans, for us overseas, many of us really still very much involved in homeland politics. Should we be concerned that we might be getting summoned to Hun Sen's court in Cambodia, or we may be arrested here in the US that we don't know what day anybody gonna come, or what sort of rights, what sort of rights as a US citizen under the United States Constitution.
So look, I think the first thing I would say is that I don't believe that an average Cambodian American should have anything to fear about being arrested or detained. Thierry undoubtedly is Cambodian American and has been targeted, but it's not necessarily because of her nationality. It's because of how outspoken a critic she has been of the government going back decades, and the fact that she has a large following, and the fact that she is physically present in Cambodia and is very, very well known. So that said, however, I would make zero assumptions if I were Cambodian American that if I've been outspoken and critical of Hun Sen's government from the United States, that if I returned home to Cambodia to visit family, for example, that I would be safe. An American passport provides zero guarantees of any kind. And historically, in my experience in Asian countries, if you're a dual national, like Thierry is, then the country in question will treat you like you are only Cambodian. So I don't know whether, and I need to find this out, but I don't know whether, for example, that if she's actually detained, the US government will be allowed to visit her, even though under international law they are supposed to be allowed to visit her. But the US government doesn't have the power to free American citizens around the world. It can only undertake its best efforts to help. Now, as an American, you have special protections and have the ability to get extra help from the United States. And so, President Obama set up a presidential policy directive called PPD 30 that that, among other things, was set up to help ensure that American hostages or American political prisoners around the world had extra help from the United States. And that policy directive created the position of a US presidential envoy on hostage affairs, whose job it is specifically to help American hostages or political prisoners around the world. And so President Trump continued that policy directive. And so there is a person in that role right now, Roger Carstens, who's a diplomat at the State Department, who is the presidential envoy in hostage affairs, and who I've already reached out to ask for help on Thierry's case, and is the kind of person that can help coordinate cross-governmental efforts to help Americans that get into these kinds of situations. And so I have every reason to believe that Thierry will get help and support from the United States. I've also already been in touch with the US ambassador to Cambodia, who was very positive in his response in expressing concern about what's happening to Thierry. And the United States, I can say unequivocally, is monitoring the situation very, very closely. I've also spoken to a senior official at the National Security Council in the White House about the case, and alerted him to what's going on also. And so I know there will be a very bright light shined on what happens next week with Thierry on Thanksgiving Day. I do not believe that there's any reason that any Cambodian American should worry about being arrested in the United States or extradited to Cambodia. Number one, the kinds of offenses that Thierry is being charged with are offenses that themselves are in violation of Cambodia's obligations under international law. In essence, she's being charged with these offenses as a pretext for going after her for her opinions and for her free speech. And so, these are undoubtedly political offenses that she's being charged with, and would be viewed as such. And the U.S. also so the U.S. will not engage in any kind of an extradition of any person anywhere in the world on the basis of political charges. And these are political charges. And she's facing a political show trial. And at the same time as well, in order for a person to be extradited from the U.S. anywhere in the world, there also has to be a bilateral or multilateral extradition treaty in place. I do not believe there is one, in fact, between Cambodia and the United States, although I would have to go back and double check that. But either way, there are exceptions in all of these treaties all over the world that the U.S. has for not extraditing people for political crimes. And so even if there was such a treaty, there'd be no reason why, if she'd been in the US and been charged with the same things in Cambodia, that the US would ever agree to send her to Cambodia. It simply wouldn't happen.
So Terry's case she is one of the 68 people, the name were posted, also ordered for to stand trial. And many people would advocate for her to leave, but she refused to leave and stay, knowing she may be facing up to 12 years in prison. To us, this is she is symbolic for the rest of those who has lesser mean than her to protect themselves. What we worrying is she's not walking out of that court free, just like the rest. In that case, if that happened, what's the next step?
Well, I don't want to broadcast to the Hun Sen government precisely what I'm going to do, as I'm sure you can understand. But I can tell you that we are preparing for that possibility. I hope and pray that that doesn't happen. But there are a wide array of steps that we would undertake, legal, political, and public relations, where we would advocate strongly for, on Thierry's behalf, to help secure her release through the UN, through the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, through the US government, both the White House, the State Department, and the United States Congress, as well as through the media. I think that, what I find interesting about having gone up against more than 20 or 25 authoritarian governments over my career as a human rights lawyer is they operate on the principle of one emotion, fear, right? Fear is what they want to impose on the local population so that they don't stand up or speak out or criticize or stand in the way of the dictator. And similarly, their decisions are motivated by fear they themselves have. Fear of loss of power, fear of justice and accountability, fear of themselves or their relatives being targeted by financial sanctions from the United States and other places, right? And what I can say unequivocally is that the move by Hun Sen to go after this group of 60 plus people, including Thierry, is not a move that demonstrates strength. It's a decision that unequivocally shows the profound weakness of Hun Sen and his regime. Because a regime that was strong, a regime that had the support of the people, would not need to undertake these kinds of activities. They would be perfectly happy with people expressing criticism of the government, and they wouldn't care because they would know that they had a support of the majority of the population. And in free and fair elections, they would be able to continue to be reelected. And so while people would criticize, they would remain strong, despite the fact that they were being criticized. The fact that Hun Sen has, over the last several years especially, really engaged in this draconian and widespread crackdown says to me that he is very, very afraid that he's going to lose his grip on power. And what that means also is that he is equally susceptible to the kinds of pressure that myself and others can bring at the very highest levels on him through a whole array of ways. And, I will spare no effort if Thierry is detained to make sure that her story is known by people all around the world and what she's going through. Make sure that we go after him and his cronies through targeted financial sanctions and asset freezes, and undertake a very, very wide array of efforts to hold him and his regime accountable for what they're doing. Obviously, all with the ultimate goal to not only secure Thieri's release, but also to highlight the broader human rights situation in Cambodia, with the goal of forcing him to relent and to step back from this precipice.
It just kind of makes us wonder what he's doing. Is he trying to dismantle the Cambodia constitution itself?
Well, I mean, clearly he is. So yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the Constitution, as adopted, and with the support of the international community in drafting it, is a brilliant document that is consistent with international best practice when it comes to the protection of civil rights and human rights of the citizens of Cambodia. Of course, in practice, it's not being observed, and so undoubtedly, it is clearly the goal of Hun Sen to maintain an iron grip on power, and despite what international law requires through international treaties to which the country is a party, as well as through its own constitution and laws, he is not going to abide by those laws or the Constitution, because he's afraid that if he were to provide those rights to the Cambodian people, that he would not be able to hold on to power. My challenge to Hun Sen would be that if you think you have so much support from your own people, then why are you afraid? You should provide for full adherence to the Constitution and to the laws of Cambodia and your obligations under international law. You should be willing to hold free and fair elections. You should be willing to have open access for political dissent. You should be able to have a free media and to have regular reporting. And you should have no need to imprison political prisoners. If you're so confident in your strength and your support from the Cambodian people, then why are you so afraid of these individual people? Cambodia is a wonderful country, a wonderful country with an enterprising and impressive and thoughtful population that has made enormous contributions to your own country and to the world, and you should trust in the wisdom and the judgment of the Cambodian people. And if you've got nothing to hide or nothing to fear, then you should cease and desist from this behavior, and allow the people to decide their own future.
But we see that he's not. He time and time again he violates not just the Constitution. He also violates the treaty, the Paris Agreement,
of course,
for example.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is if you have a comment on that. How is it possible that he keep doing it and there's no consequences? We know that the financial pieces, that's one of them, just the beginning. The ABA, slightly a little bit, that he said, oh, that's just coin and change. He doesn't care. What else can the international community do to put more pressure on Hun Sen?
Well, it's obviously challenging. I mean, Hun Sen has much more closely aligned himself in recent years with China and has a lot of support from Beijing. I think that the primary thing that one can do is that, Cambodia continues to receive a lot of foreign development assistance. And one of the things that should be done, in my view, is to condition foreign assistance on simple adherence by his government to the requirements of the Cambodian Constitution and its laws and its obligations under international law. And so I think that that's one of the things that can be done to put pressure on the government. Another can be to go after gross human rights abusers and those involved in grand corruption in this government, to hold them to account publicly and to send a very clear signal to the Cambodian people that you're not alone. Right? The international community knows what's happening in Cambodia, understands what's going on, and is prepared to provide whatever support it can from where it is to ensure that the Cambodian people can see a restoration of democracy and human rights to the country. So as a start, those would be two good first measures in my view. Obviously, there's a lot more that can be done, and it depends on political will. What is the political will of the international community? In this regard. So this is the challenge I think that we all have, is there's a lot happening in the world, and to maintain a focus on holding Hun Sen to account is very difficult in light of COVID and all the other, and global financial challenges the world is facing, et cetera. But all we can do is the best we can do, and speak truth to power, and to speak out against dictatorships and their actions. And we couldn't do what we're doing without the courage and the perseverance and the resilience of people like Thierry Seng, who undoubtedly is putting her life at risk by appearing in court and is prepared to go to prison for what she believes. And it's people like her who inspire me as a human rights lawyer in all that I do. All any of us can do is try to help people like her, like Sam Renzi and others, who are prepared to risk their lives for the sake of their people. So dictators invariably are unable to understand the mindset of somebody like Thierry, who is just not going to be prepared to run away, is not afraid. It's not that she wants to go to prison, of course, but Cambodia is her home and her country and her people, and she's not going to give them up simply because an autocrat and a thug threatens her. And so she's prepared to risk everything for the sake of her country, which is incredibly admirable and obviously very dangerous, and of course makes people like me, as a friend of hers for several decades, very worried about what might happen next. But my experience has been that dictators like Hun Sen, who demonstrate such profound fear, are susceptible to international pressure in a wide array of ways. And so my view is, if he is so confident in the support that he has from the Cambodian people, he has no need to convict Thierry and the others in this upcoming trial, and he can simply instruct his prosecutors to drop the charges against them. To me, that would be a sign of strength on Hun Sen's part, is if he dropped the charges, knowing because he was confident that Thierry and her colleagues didn't have support, that people weren't going to listen to what they had to say, and that he could just ignore them, right? And so to me, if he did that, then I would start to conclude, well, maybe he's stronger than I thought, right? Because he's not afraid of his own people. But any leader who's afraid of his own people, especially somebody as non-threatening as Thierry, who is a wonderful person, a nonviolent activist, and somebody who undoubtedly has shown over and over her commitment to helping her own people, why should he be afraid of someone like her? And yet his actions so far demonstrate that he's very afraid of her. And so to me, again, that demonstrates profound weakness, not strength.
Well, Jared, thank you so much for being with me today.
Well, thanks so much, and we'll keep at it, and obviously happy to continue to remain in touch.
That was Jared Genser, the international human rights lawyer representing Thierry Seng on her case that accused by the Cambodia government of treason to stand trial on Thanksgiving Day. More to come soon. I'm Soo Pin. Thank you for tuning in. See you next time.